Hello there, Steve.
How are you, my friend?
No major complaints.
Well, good. You're lucky. You just live right.
Well, when I wake up in the morning and the body moves on command, everything else falls into place.
There you go.
Well, hello, Terry. Mr. McCabe.
Hello, Mr. Barone, how are you?
Good.
Anybody gonna watch football tonight?
No.
Yes.
Hey, Carolee.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, Art, can you hear me now?
Now, yes.
Okay.
That's a lot better.
For some reason, Zoom has a mind of its own and it shuts you down and then it starts all over again.
Isn't that the truth? It's so weird.
So Robert, you are the alternate for this evening, and I know that Commissioner Curry is not joining us tonight, so you good to go?
Here. Perfect,
Thank you.
Robert, you have to be on your best behavior now because you're an alternate.
I'll pay attention.
Britton, I don't see Nat or Sophia. Is it just us tonight? Oh, man. He hears me talking about him.
Everybody's
Nat.
present. Just not everybody's accounted for on the video screen. Nat has a
Here
really
too,
great
Amanda.
background, though.
Oh, hi, Sophia.
Hi there.
Miss Parr, you also have Myrna joining us, so she's also helping out. But only the important people have their videos on.
Hi, Myrna. Glad to have you here. Okay, are we ready to get started?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good evening. The time is 6 p.m. and I would like to welcome everyone to our meeting of the City of Georgetown Historic and Architectural Review Commission. The Historic and Architectural Review Commission, appointed by the mayor and the city council, is responsible for hearing and taking final action on applications for certificates of appropriateness based upon the city council adopted downtown and old town design guidelines and the Unified Development Code. This virtual meeting format is different from the regular meetings at City Hall, but we will still follow a similar meeting format. We will consider the cases scheduled for this meeting individually as follows. Staff will make a presentation of the case, and then I will give the commissioners an opportunity to ask questions to staff. After the staff presentation, the applicant or their representative will have up to 10 minutes to present or provide comments on their project if they choose, followed by questions from the commissioners. Once staff and the applicant have addressed questions from the commissioners, we will open the meeting for the public hearing. If you would like to provide comments on the agenda item, please wait until I open the public hearing. When I open the public hearing, I will ask if anyone would like to speak, and if you would, please unmute yourself and state your name. Once we have the name of everyone who would like to speak, I will call the names in order, and when your name is called, you will have up to 3 minutes. A speaker may allot their time to another speaker for a maximum of 6 minutes. If you wish to allot your time to another speaker, please indicate so when I open the public hearing. Please remember that all comments and questions must be addressed to the commission, and please be patient while we organize the speakers during the public hearing portion. You also have the opportunity to provide comments through the Q&A section of the meeting located on the right-hand side of your screen. Please provide your full name, address for the record, and your comment will be read by staff. After everyone who is asked to speak has spoken, I will close the public hearing and provide a few minutes of rebuttal time to the applicant if they so choose. Following this set of questions, I will ask the commissioners for a motion and a second, followed by deliberation and any additional questions to staff or to the applicant. Then I will call for a vote on the motion. If the applicant or a member of the public has questions or concerns following a vote on an agenda item, please communicate those to the recording secretary outside of this meeting so that staff can follow up with you. You can provide your contact information through the Q&A section and request follow-up. You can call the planning department at 512-930-3575, or you can email historic@georgetown.org. I would like to remind everyone to please state your name before you make any comments. That includes staff, commissioners, applicants, and members of the public who speak during the public comment portion of the meeting. If you're a member of the public, please also provide your address. The first agenda item is this is item C, which is consideration and possible action to approve the minutes from the August 27th, 2020 regular meeting of the Historic and Architectural Review Commission. Does anyone have any edits or changes to the minutes? Okay, not seeing anyone or hearing anyone, I will entertain a motion.
I make a motion to approve the minutes as submitted.
Thank you, Commissioner Morales. Can I have a second, please?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Johnston. Okay, I have a motion to approve as written by Commissioner Morales and a second by Commissioner Johnston. I will call for a vote. Commissioner Parr, approve. Commissioner Johnston?
Approved.
Commissioner Browner?
Yes.
Commissioner Morales?
Yes.
Commissioner Hyde?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner McCabe?
Yes.
And Commissioner Nunn?
I was absent, so I'll abstain.
Okay, thank you, Carolee. Thank you for making note of that. The motion approved. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to item D. This is a public hearing and possible action on a request for a certificate of appropriateness for an addition that creates a new or adds to an existing street-facing facade at the property located at 1257 South Church Street, bearing the legal description of Lot 18, Block 1 of the Cody Edition. I'll turn it over to Britton.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. This is Britton Bostick, Downtown and Historic Planner. And so the request before y'all tonight is categorized and as an addition that creates a new or adds to an existing street-facing facade. And that addition is for porch screening in this case. So this is the house at 1257 South Church. And you can see it's located just at the corner of South Church Street and East 15th Street. And it's one of our more unusual properties in that it is surrounded by 3 streets. So it's got South Myrtle Street to the rear. This is a house that is very near to 2 of our National Register historic districts. So the yellow area is the Belford National Register Historic District, and the purple area is the University Elm Historic District. So this is a medium priority structure, and it's surrounded by other medium priority structures, low priority structures, and then nearby you've got some high priority structures as well. So kind of right in the middle of everything. On the 1916 Sanborn map, we can see that this house had not been built yet. So the Historic Resource Survey estimated a construction date of 1925. When I was looking into this property, it was really interesting to find that Mrs. Cody had platted this subdivision. And I learned after that report was published that I believe Mrs. Cody was the widow of basically a dean of Southwestern University. And so the Cody family had a lot of kind of interest in investment here, both in property and in Southwestern University. So that's her association. And then I believe that she may have been the one who had this house built, which she pretty quickly gave to her sons, and then they sold. And then we can see in 1925, the house was there, as was the garage, and that had not changed by 1940. And things haven't changed too much on that property since that time. There have been a few adjustments, some color changes, some roof material changes to the house, but the 1964 and 1974 photos show pretty much the same footprint that we can see today. We do have a photo from 1984. These are not the clearest photos. They come from a pretty small file size, so are not able to always give a really clear 1984 photo, but it does show the front of the house that we recognize today with that kind of very interesting roof style with the front. So here it is. You can see this is a pretty large front porch. It's an L shape that wraps around the southwest corner of the house. And the reason that the applicant has requested this porch screening is so that they can enjoy that front porch during the summer when there are a lot of mosquitoes nearby and not have to be so concerned about being mosquito targets. And so the applicant has provided some drawings showing what that screening would look like installed. And so this is not proposed to be in front of the front door. It's proposed to have basically a door to the side of the front door to enter the screened area, but would leave the front door of the structure kind of clear from the screening. So rather than having to go through two sets of doors, it would still just be the front door, and then you could enter kind of the porch from the side. And the screening material the applicant is proposing to install behind the existing railing and behind those kind of beautiful arches that make up the porch features. And so it wouldn't be installed on the street side, it would be installed on the back side and help to keep mosquitoes out that way. The screening product that they're proposing is called a better view pool and patio screening. So the applicants provided some product information for that. And they had also provided me with a section of the screen. And now that we're on video, I'm holding this up and hopefully you can see it's pretty see-through. And that was something that they wanted to illustrate to the commission. So I took a picture of it, but in person, you can kind of see it's in front of my face now. So there's not a lot of kind of blocking of the view with that product is what they wanted the commission to know. So when staff reviewed the application, we found that it complied with the design guidelines and the requirements. In two instances, the requirements didn't apply, and that was because there's not a new building or addition proposed, an addition in terms of kind of new footprint construction. And then also there was no signage proposed. We did have two design guidelines that were applicable to screening, and those were in the staff report, and staff found that the request complied with both of those. And so actually three signs, commissioners, 3 signs were posted because this property has 3 street facades. I've not received any public comments on this request. And so staff is recommending approval of the request for the porch screening. And as usual, you have options when you make a motion to approve as presented by the applicant, to deny as presented by the applicant, to approve with conditions, or to postpone the decision. And if you do need to approve with conditions or postpone, please make that clear in the motion what those conditions or that postponement period or need is. The applicant was planning to join us for the meeting, so we might just check and see if they're here. They did not have a presentation to make and just wanted to be available in case there were any questions from the commissioners. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Britton. Nat or Myrna, do we have the applicant on the phone or on video, and would they like to state anything?
I do believe Michael Houston is on the line.
Yes.
Great.
Hi, Michael. Is there anything that you'd like to add to Britton's presentation?
And we appreciate Britton's presentation. It really, essentially says everything we wanted to say, that we think it's going to have really no visual impact from the street, either 15th or Church. It'll be almost invisible, and it's a pretty heavily shaded and screened by vegetation porch already. So it'll be, I think most people won't even know anything has been changed.
Okay, thank you. Britton, I did have a couple questions, and either the applicant or Britton can answer answer these. So from the drawings, it looks like when you're standing at the front door, to the right would be another door. Is that what you're right behind that column right there?
Yes.
That's a screen door.
Entry to the porch.
So if you look, yeah. So from the street, you wouldn't notice it at all. If you stepped up on the porch to ring the doorbell, you would see it.
So you would turn to your right and then enter into the door there.
Yes.
Okay. And then my other question is, I understand it looks like the screening is very see-through and all those things. And I know you're not changing anything. You're just applying it to the interior of the porch. But if you were to remove that, because, for a future owner, you know, just the future preservation of this structure, which is fabulous on Church Street. When you would remove that, you would just have things like screw holes and things that would need to be filled and painted. You wouldn't be changing any of the structure at all, or be adding any additional wood or support or any of that?
No.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, so it could easily be removed if someone wished in the future.
Yes.
It'll be a fitted aluminum tubular frame that could be removed completely.
Okay, okay, thank you. Commissioners, what questions do you have for staff or the applicant?
This is Carol Lee, and I do have one.
Okay.
So my question is, are there any vertical supports that are visible that those aren't demonstrated in anything, but the example shows that they're, you know, they're on the manufacturer's sheet, or is the screen stretched from column to column?
The screen is stretched from column to column. This is Mary Ann. And there is one vertical thing that on that would support the door. If you look on that drawing of the door, you'll see that there is one little skinny piece of aluminum that will go straight up from there. But that's everything else, any support is going to be right behind the railing, so that you see the horizontal support and two little vertical things that'll go right behind the railing.
In drawing B.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or C, either one. But the top part is a full screen, nothing there. I mean, nothing visible.
It'll be behind the arched sort of up.
Yeah, sort of within the arch. It's pretty amazing design, actually, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. What other questions or comments do we have from the commissioners? Okay. Not hearing any other questions or comments, I will open the public hearing. Do we have anyone on the line or on Zoom to speak for the public hearing?
There is one number that has called in the public. If they would wish to speak, you can unmute now, or perhaps you're just here to listen. Mirna, I do not have anybody signed up to speak on my end. Has anybody contacted you in advance of the meeting?
No.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Anyone, the person that's on the line, do you wish to say anything this evening? Okay. Not hearing anyone, I'm going to close the public hearing. And I will ask the commissioners one more time if they have any questions or comments for the applicant or staff. Okay, not hearing anything, I will entertain a motion.
This is Carol Lee, and I move that we approve as presented by the applicant.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Morales, I'll second.
Okay, I'm sorry. Was that Catherine?
It was me, but somebody else also spoke.
It's fine. It can be Catherine. Doesn't matter.
Thank you. Okay. We have a motion to approve by Commissioner Nunn and a second by Commissioner Morales. I will take a vote. Commissioner Parr, approve. Commissioner Johnston?
Approve.
Commissioner Browner?
Yes.
Commissioner Morales?
Yes.
Commissioner Hyde?
Yes.
Commissioner McCabe?
Yes.
And Commissioner Nunn?
Approve.
Thank you. That motion carries, approved as written. Thank you all very much for attending the meeting. We appreciate it. Okay, moving on to item F, which is an infill presentation by our city staff. I don't know if that's Nat or Britton or Sophia. Take it away.
It's my turn tonight, Britton again. And so we wanted to take this opportunity of having just one case to do a little bit of training. And by training, we mean talk through some of the pretty frequent things that y'all see either in applications or in staff reports and make sure that you have a really kind of sound basis for reviewing these, really wanting to make sure that you had the vocabulary that you need. And so wanted to point out some things that you see quite a bit and see more when we're looking at infill development. And so things like distinction between mass and scale and what those words mean, those are referenced in our design guidelines. Some definitions for commercial infill development. Really wanted to talk about what building height means, because building height in our code is something that we wanted to make sure y'all had great familiarity with, and how that's evaluated, and then how that also has a relationship to roof styles. And then also some key concepts that come out of our design guidelines, not the design guidelines really specifically this time, just kind of some general guiding principles that are in there that you don't always see highlighted in the staff reports. And so some of the things that we wanted to cover tonight, frequently used terms, UDC requirements like setbacks, again, building height, going to focus a little bit more on that, floor area ratio, impervious cover. Look a little bit at the design guidelines for commercial project, give you some commercial infill examples, talk about materials, and then show you what the additional infill development applications look like for commercial, because usually a certificate of appropriateness is just a starting point for a series of applications when we're looking at commercial development, which we don't see really often in our historic districts, but we do see it. And so to get started, wanted to talk about massing and what that even means. And so I went to architecture school, and when we were going through what massing is, we created these little cardboard models, and they didn't necessarily have windows and they didn't necessarily have details. It was just more to understand what does this thing look like in its very, very basic kind of essence. And so the windows are details, the cornices are details, all these architectural features are details. Massing is really basic, and massing is referring to our perception of the shape and form and size of a building. And so if you kind of just take off all the decoration, what's left is something that we kind of consider to be the building mass. And so mass combines with shape to define the form. And also it can be size relative to context. So when we say we want the mass of something to be compatible with surrounding structures, we're really looking at the very basic element of the building, not really the decoration. And that's a little bit different than scale. And you can see my scale figure here, Godzilla, for an example. Godzilla is kind of large in scale with these other buildings, especially the one on the far left. And so scale is the relationship to the surrounding buildings or to another building. So when we talk about the scale of the building, we're talking about these relationships, and scale really has to have context. And so it's hard to evaluate building scale without seeing what else is around it. So when you see us provide you with examples of the context or talk about surrounding structures, that's when we're talking about the scale of what's being presented. And scale and mass are kind of related, but scale is just really more that comparison, and mass is more what does the building itself look like, and how do we perceive it? Usually we're perceiving it from the street. So back to architecture school for everybody. Y'all are going to have undergrads in architecture by the time I'm done with you tonight. But there was a man named Louis Sullivan, who was a very famous architect around the turn of the 20th century. And he is credited as being kind of the father of modernism and the father of the skyscraper. So he did a lot of work in the Midwest. He's really well known for doing really tall buildings in Chicago. And sometimes Frank Lloyd Wright gets credited for the quote, form follows function, but it was really Louis Sullivan. And so when we talk about building form, we're talking about the shape of a building. And y'all will hear me more frequently say roof form, meaning the shape of a roof. So when we say form, we're really talking about the shape. Again, without the decoration, it's really more kind of what are the basic elements. So a triangle can be a form, a rectangle can be a form. And when we say the form of a building, we're really looking at that basic shape. Setbacks are something that we see a lot for residential properties. Y'all are pretty accustomed to requests for setback modifications for residential, but I wanted to talk just a little bit about what that means. And they're different for commercial properties. So in the downtown overlay district, and so in our downtown specifically, building setbacks, we're used to buildings having to be off the property line, But in our downtown, there's a 0 setback line for the streets, meaning we're asking people to build all the way up to the city sidewalk, so that rather than having the buildings set back from the street, they're right there. You can walk right off the sidewalk and into a building. And so that's why you see the downtown being constructed differently from residential properties, where we're asking residential properties to be set back from the street. And in the downtown, it's kind of its own special deal in that zoning district. In Old Town, and we still do have some commercial in Old Town, we don't see a lot of new commercial, but it could happen. And so the setbacks in Old Town are, it says that of the underlying base zoning district, meaning that we have setbacks for our commercial zoning districts. Our downtown is its own special mixed use downtown zoning district. It's special and it exists nowhere else in the city of Georgetown. But in Old Town, we can have commercial zoning like commercial neighborhood, commercial 1, commercial 3. And so those are usually maybe a 20 or a 15 or a 20-foot setback, kind of depending. And so when we evaluate those, usually staff will provide that information, or we'll ask to see it on the plans so that the Harc commissioners can evaluate it. But just because we're used to seeing residential, we're used to those setbacks and modifying those. It's a little bit different for commercial, and especially different in the downtown. So an example of that is here on Austin Avenue, where the buildings are usually coming right up to the property line, especially along the streets. And so you're not required to bring the building all the way up to the property line. And in some cases, you'll see a building a little bit set back, either because of the design of the building or because it's providing landscaping or providing kind of a portico or porch area. There are a few different reasons why. So most of the buildings directly on the square are built right up to the property line, but as we get off the square, we might tend to see some differences. It just depends. Building height, we wanted to talk about very specifically because we wanted to make sure that y'all were familiar with how our code defines building height. And it's a little bit different than maybe some people think. So in our downtown overlay district, the area around the square, a little bit north, south, east, west, building height is not allowed to exceed 40 feet unless Harc approves something different. And so there is the opportunity for someone to apply for a building height modification to that 40 feet. What is important also, I think, to know in our code is that buildings located along Austin Avenue in the downtown overlay district, so that begins really kind of at the new River Place development, right at the beginning of the bridge over the San Gabriel River. And that goes all the way down to University Avenue. So that whole stretch of Austin Avenue, new buildings have to be at least 2 stories in height with an overall building height of not less than 20 feet. So we do have a lot of 1-story buildings, but new construction coming in, we would be asking to comply with this and give us 2 stories. And that's partially to help kind of with the streetscape, with the appearance of things, and to help with kind of this look for downtown that we're asking for. What is a little bit different, and what I'll get to in a minute, is if a property is in the courthouse view protection overlay district. Now that's a whole different thing. So we'll get to that in a minute, but just weren't sure that everybody was familiar with the 40-foot height limit, and also that buildings on Austin Avenue have to be at least 2 usable stories in height and at least 20 feet tall. In the Old Town overlay, and we're used to seeing residential development in Old Town, but we do have some commercial could happen. Buildings have to be shorter. They can't exceed 30 feet in height unless Harc approves a building height modification. And at the setback, so this is for residential and for commercial, at the setback, buildings can't be higher than 15 feet, which is really about 1 story or 1.5 stories. It's not quite 2 stories. So you also do have the opportunity to approve setback modifications, and we've seen those fairly recently for residential additions. But just wanted to make sure that y'all are aware there's a 30-foot building height limit with 15 feet at the setbacks. The way that we measure that, though, I think is really important to highlight. So building height is not the very tippy top of a building usually. If you have a sloped roof, it's the average of the ridge height and the eave height. So about halfway up the roof usually. And so somebody could come in with a building that had a sloped roof, either a gable roof style or a hipped roof style, or gambrel roof style, and the very tippy top of it could be 35 feet, and the eave could be 25 feet, and the building height, according to our development code, would be measured at the 30 feet. And so they would meet that requirement, even though the very top of the building was actually 35. And so when you're looking at a flat roof, it's basically the highest point of that flat roof surface, because flat roofs aren't really flat. They have to be a little bit sloped for water to run off. If you do have a really flat roof, you probably also have a swimming pool on days like yesterday. So, so that's something that is important to how we define building height. And what I want to draw your attention to is at the bottom on part 4 of that, it says roof parapets may exceed the height limitations of this code by no more than 10 feet. So when we're talking about building height limits and we say buildings in the downtown can only be 40 feet tall, that's 40 feet to the top of the flat roof portion. And if the building has a parapet, then that parapet can be up to 10 feet taller in addition. So you could feasibly have a building that is from the street viewer 50 feet tall, but the building height as we measure it by our code is only 40 feet tall. And I hope that makes sense. If not, I provided some illustrations showing some flat roofs. And so you can see in the illustration on the left, they're showing the building height is up to the highest point of the roof or structure, but that parapet wall is just a little bit higher. And one of the reasons that we allow for that is because parapets can act as screening for mechanical equipment. So most of the buildings on the square were built before we had air conditioning. Many of them were built before we even had electricity. And so when the parapets were put up, they really kind of protected the view of maybe some of these skylight features or able to provide some decorative elements. But the second function that they often serve nowadays is to hide rooftop mechanical equipment from street view so that we don't see this equipment. Georgetown's development code requires screening of mechanical equipment, meaning we don't want to see it. And so you either have to accomplish that by using the roof to screen that equipment, or at the very top, you can see it's pointing to an equipment screen. So that's another option. If your mechanical equipment is taller than the roof parapet and you could see it from down below, then we ask you to put a screen around it so that that mechanical equipment is not visible. So a lot of times those taller parapet heights can help screen the equipment that we don't always have room on the ground to put it. So some of these, they're condensing units. Everybody's probably got one in their backyard. And so if you put it on the ground, you're also required to screen it or put a fence around it. But if you put it on top of a building, it's kind of a convenient way to hide it, and then you don't have to deal with it on the ground. So that's why that sometimes happens. We do have a few exceptions to the building height limits, and we saw an example of this, if y'all remember, on the old Masonic Lodge, which now has the Gumbo's restaurant. That's really what it's known for. There's an onion dome on that building, and there was an onion dome. We're waiting for the new one to come in, but that onion dome exceeds the building height limit. And the reason that that dome replacement didn't need a building height modification is because architectural features like belfries, cupolas, spires, domes, monuments, chimneys, receiving antennas, chimney flues, kind of those smaller architectural features are not part of the building height limit. And so those special features are not limited to the 40 feet. And then if there's an elevator or water tank or other kind of necessary mechanical equipment, it can be taller than the 40 feet as long as it doesn't take up more than a third of the roof area. And so if someone had to put kind of an elevator housing on the very top of the building, in most cases, we wouldn't consider that part of the building height limit either. The courthouse view protection area is kind of a really unique part of our code, and it applies very particularly along Austin Avenue and along parts of I-35. And so what we want people to be able to do is have the experience of seeing our courthouse dome, which if you drive along Austin Avenue or if you drive along parts of I-35, you can look over and see our courthouse dome. And so we want to protect that view and not let buildings grow up around that block that view. And so what we require is that if you are in the gray areas, you are allowed to build a building of 1 story in height. There's not a specific number of feet to that, but you're allowed to build 1 story in height, or you have to request a kind of staff level review and determination saying whether or not you would be able to go taller than that. And in that process, it's an application. And so staff reviews that to see if the proposed building would cause any obstruction of the view of the courthouse dome. And calculations have to be provided with that kind of show elevations. And it's really fun to review. It's kind of interesting to see those drawings. And that's the goal, is to try to protect the view of our courthouse, which is unique to us. And also the courthouse sits lower than some of our major roads. And so that's why we have the view and we want to be able to enjoy it. Floor area ratio is something that we do not see very often in Harc, but Harc has the opportunity to modify floor area ratio. So I wanted to make sure y'all were aware of that. The floor area ratio is basically if you take the lot area and you look at the building area, you want the allowable floor area to be a certain percentage of it. So this is the example, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot and you have an FAR of 0.65, you can't exceed a 6,500 square foot building. And that's not just the first floor, that's first, second, third, fourth floors, and so on. So the different zoning districts have different FAR limits. Not all zoning districts have that limitation. So I don't believe we have it in the downtown overlay district. We see this more in the residential single family zoning that has a floor area ratio limit of 0.45. But Harc has the opportunity to modify that if requested. And there's some evaluation of that. So we usually don't see a request for that because usually impervious cover limits take care of that. But sometimes we do see it. And so you can see in the Old Town Overlay District, we have the 0.45 limit, which is what y'all are used to seeing, which is the same as impervious cover for residential. Impervious cover is different for commercial properties though. And so what a lot of people aren't aware of, but which is really cool and special to our downtown, is that we are over the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone. And so we have to kind of take special care of how we manage rainwater, what we call stormwater in the city. And because we're over the Edwards Aquifer recharge area, we're responsible for helping to maintain standards for water quality, meaning oils and pollutants and other materials that can get into our rainwater as it goes toward the Edwards Aquifer. We want to try to keep that as clean as possible. And so the city has some standards to help accomplish that. And then we also want to manage the quantity of water. And so we do that in part by helping to retain what we call pervious cover. So we want areas of ground that are able to soak up rainwater so that it all doesn't run off into the street and then run off into our stormwater systems and potentially cause some flooding or other problems. So normally when you propose a commercial development in Georgetown, you have to address all of that stormwater that you're creating with paving and building roofs and other hard materials that the rainwater can't get through. You're required to address that on the site. But many years ago, some very clever people decided to treat downtown as one single site. And so rather than having a bunch of stormwater ponds in our downtown, which would not have been visually very attractive, that all goes to what we call regional ponds, meaning the stormwater is kind of geared to run off to very specific areas before it gets to the San Gabriel River. And you are allowed to have more impervious cover on commercial properties than you are on residential properties. So we're used to seeing 0.45 in residential areas, but for our downtown, you're allowed to have 70% impervious cover. And then if the engineering department approves it, then you're allowed to have up to 95%. And so impervious cover is not something that Harc has the opportunity to modify, and it's really not something that we have a modification process for. So when we look at how a site is developed, that's not something that we can make any changes to or give any allowances for, but it does it's a limit that helps us to kind of, in our review, understand how much stormwater can impact our systems and how much is allowed. So for our downtown. Didn't know if y'all knew that we have a very special system for that helps keep our downtown more attractive and keeps us from having a bunch of water ponds on properties there. So when we get to the commercial infill design guidelines, y'all get to see kind of all of the bullet points when we do the staff reports, but I wanted to highlight some of the concepts behind those. And so when you read your design guidelines, or if you're reviewing an application and you're just thinking, you know, I wonder, but like, what's the guiding principle behind it? They're highlighted here in red. And so where it says policy and has text in bold, has some of the guiding principles behind the more specific or more technical requirements in our guidelines. So asking that buildings be visually compatible with traditional commercial buildings, asking that the form or the shape of a building be similar to those seen traditionally, building materials being visually compatible with the materials of the downtown, and then a building appearing similar, there's that word scale, similar in scale to traditional commercial buildings. And so what we're asking for new development to do is to blend in pretty well with what we already have and to not detract from it. And so here's one of our words again: the overall mass of a new building should convey a sense of human scale. And if you'll remember, mass is our perception, basically our perception of the building size. So if you're a pedestrian standing on the sidewalk, how do you perceive that building? And sometimes that takes a little bit of imagination to kind of think, how would that experience be for you as a pedestrian? But that's one of the guiding principles and why we wanted to highlight what mass means. Building materials for new construction should be visually compatible with the predominant materials of this area, meaning we have really traditional materials that came out of the ground, that came from local sources oftentimes. So we have a lot of limestone, and we know that limestone is pretty common to Central Texas. The limestone didn't have to come from a long way away. It could be quarried pretty close by. We have a lot of wood, and so that's something that we're accustomed to. And then a little while after we had the stone and wood, we got brick, and so a lot of our historic buildings are also built with brick. And so that's what you see a lot of. We do have a lot of glass also, but new glass and old glass can look very different. And so a lot of times what we ask for is that the glass in new buildings not look like really fancy, super shiny, very reflective new glass. We're asking for it to be more similar to our clear glass that we see in traditional buildings. And then in portions of area 2, so not the blocks directly around the square, but the other parts of downtown, areas that were developed as residential and have a residential character, we're asking new development to match that residential character. And so generally keeping buildings that kind of feel good when you're a pedestrian and don't feel overwhelming when you're walking down the sidewalk, and building materials that are similar to what's surrounding and kind of fit in really well, and don't detract from it, but kind of add to it. And so I wanted to show you a side-by-side of two very similar building materials with very similar styles. And this is kind of a happy thing to realize we had two similar building forms very close to each other in our downtown. So the image on the left is off of East 8th Street. It's part of the Dimmitt building, which was built around the turn of the 20th century. And this is a building that's built with limestone and then wood windows. And so really the materials that you see are limestone, wood, and glass. There's a little bit of metal at the top for a decorative trim. The building on the right is the new Heritage Court development, which is on Church Street, just down at the corner from the Dimmitt building. And so you also see limestone, rather than wood, you see aluminum for the windows, you see the glass, and then this also has some metal, and it's got a little bit of brick for the detailing. And so some of the differences in materials are the way the stones are cut, the aluminum that's used for the windows instead of the wood. And so aluminum doesn't usually get painted. We usually see it in either a silver or a dark bronze color, sometimes a black color, whereas wood might be painted in a variety of colors. And so there are a lot of similarities. There are a lot of differences. And one of the differences that you see too is in the proportion in the materials. And so the windows are different proportions. The stone is different proportions. So you can have very similar materials, but they might just work out differently from what was built in old construction and what's being built in new construction. Sometimes that's just due to the materials that are available are different today than they used to be. But sometimes it's also where the sources come from. So as you walk around downtown, drive around downtown, always good to be looking around at the materials to see what do we have, and then what do we have that's old and what do we have that's new, and I always find that really helpful. So here are some other examples of materials. We've got new brick, we've got old brick, we've got new stone, we've got old stone. And one of the things that we tend to see quite a bit is stucco. Stucco, I don't know that it's a traditional building material and that it's been around for a long time, but we don't have many buildings that I can identify as originally stucco. In our case, we tend to have buildings, and the photos on the left kind of illustrate this. We tend to have buildings that might have gotten stuccoed later in time, either instead of the building materials being repaired or because we went through a time period that we were trying to have sleeker looking buildings and the stucco helped accomplish, rather than add detail, it helped kind of remove detail and give this kind of sleek mid-century look that was really popular for a while. But what I'm finding and what I'm starting to get some questions about is that a lot of times nowadays, people are looking to remove that stucco and bring back the original brick or stone facades. And so we do have quite a bit of stucco, but usually that came later and was not some of the original material. Our original materials tend to be brick, stone, and wood pretty much exclusively. And so a lot of our new buildings reflect that, and you'll see brick, stone, and aluminum windows instead of the wood windows that we used to get. And so we're usually the first stop in a process for a new development, but there are other applications. And so Harc is not the only commission that gets to see applications related to development in our historic districts. If a property has to be subdivided or platted, that goes to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a decision. If there's a site development plan, that also goes to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a decision. If there are any administrative exceptions, and that could be something like a courthouse view determination or a parking exception, or something that's within what staff has been approved to approve, then that just goes to staff. And then if there's a building permit needed, and most of the time when Harc is hearing a case, there is a building permit needed, then that's also reviewed at the staff level. So a couple of applications will go through the public hearing process and be heard by a commission or at least reviewed by a commission. And then a couple of applications will just be reviewed by staff. So that is kind of a summary of commercial infill development and some of the terms that are pretty frequently used, some of the terms you may have heard us use or seen in the staff reports, and hopefully that answered some questions or provided some good information. But I do want to make sure that this was helpful and ask if there is more information that's needed, or is there any kind of extra explanation we need to give, or is there more information that y'all would like to see in the future or questions that you have?
Thank you, Britton. I just have one question. So as you were talking, you mentioned several times things like should fit in with the downtown, or, you know, I think we talk about that a lot, that things should, yes, like that's a good example. But how would we, you know, I think we are seeing some more modern structures that are in downtown. So to use the example of the Performing Arts Center that we have over by El Monumento. And so, you know, when we talk about them looking like downtown, and I know that we don't want exact replicas, that's not what we're trying to create either, but how do we talk about those, and how do we factor in an infill project that is on the more modern spectrum, possibly?
I think that's a really great question. And we've had a lot of new construction activity on the north end of our downtown. So there's the River Place development, there's the new Performing Arts Center, there's some residential development that's right there around the Performing Arts Center. And so what we're looking for is where you go, I think, has a lot to do with it. Because if you look at our guiding principles, we're asking questions that are kind of relative to the context. And so if you're right on the square, then that's a very specific context that has much older buildings. They're all of very similar time period, and so you see really similar characteristics in those buildings. When you go to the west side of the square, where I'm sitting right now in the planning department, so the building that I'm in is a historic building. It's an old building, it's an old brick building, and it's got some funky kind of features that we can pretty easily identify as historic. But we're right next to the public library. And the library is one of the photos. I think I've So I've actually got the library and the kind of right under material. That's a photo of our public library. But there are not a lot of old buildings over near where I am. And so we see the new City Hall building, we see the new City Council chambers, we see the new library, we see some parking lots. And then we also see some residential structures that may or may not have been converted to commercial. But since there are not a lot of buildings around to compare this to, there's kind of a little more, if I may say it this way, there's kind of a little more wiggle room for newer materials because there are not so many old buildings surrounding it. And I think that's kind of where we are with the north end of our historic district. It's a historic district and it gives us the opportunity to go through this review process, but there were not as many old buildings to compare those buildings to. And so there was, I think, a little more wiggle room or flexibility in the design and the use of the materials, because it's not out of place to put a new looking building where there are no old looking buildings. And so where buildings go in our historic districts, I think is really important. Just like when we look at requests for setback modifications, we tend to look at what are the surrounding structures, and is the setback modification being requested, would it be similar to surrounding structures? I think we can ask similar questions here and say, what are the materials proposed here and what are the materials of the surrounding structures? Are the surrounding structures newer or are they older? And is this something that is kind of like really going to stand out, or is this something that's going to kind of like live very happily with its neighbors? And those might sound a little bit touchy-feely, and I guess the way I'm phrasing them is, but since we focus a lot on context and a lot of the design guidelines are based on compatibility, things that are very relative to what's surrounding it, I think we really look at what's surrounding and then kind of make a decision from there. Because some things might be new materials or they might be a newer design, but they would still fit in well with the surrounding properties.
Britton, I have a question. It's
Yes,
Catherine. This came up a lot before you were with us on Eats on 8, where that was commercial infill because of the destruction of a building that had been there. And one of the things that was discussed several times was the concept of air rights, which don't exist in our design guidelines. And that was, they wanted to put up a 4-story building, which was going to block all the residential people surrounding, you know, them, where they loss of sunlight, loss of airflow, loss of all sorts of things. And so is there any look toward adding in something about air rights? I mean, it comes close to it when you talk about the sight line for the courthouse. And that's not air rights, it's a sight line, but sight lines and air rights could be similar. So if there's a commercial building that's going to be 4 stories high in front of your house, you know, is there any recourse for somebody?
Well, so that's a really great question. And I think I have a couple of different ways that I want to answer it. One is, whoops, that's Old Town. So that's a downtown example. So I'll use the downtown height limit. One of the challenges of having the mixed use downtown zoning district, which is also our downtown overlay district, is that it is butted right up next to residential zoning in some cases. And there is kind of a shared line between our downtown district and our Old Town district. And so on one side of that line, you can go up to 40 feet, and on the other side of the line, you can go up to 30 feet. But that doesn't mean that everybody is at 30 and 40 feet. And the buildings are usually designed differently, so that height difference might be more substantial, like right along that line. And so air rights are usually something that you would see in New York City comes to mind as an example, because there have been a lot of air rights cases fought out over New York City properties.
Yes, I used to live there.
So you're very familiar with that. So our height limits are low enough that air rights as a legal concept probably is not going to go very far in these conversations. But I think when we look at things like building mass, so is the building kind of stepping back as it goes up, or is it all the way to the edge, all the way up? Because if it's all the way to the edge, all the way up, it just kind of appears much larger, right? And then we have scale, which is what is the size of this building compared to the buildings next to it? And so when we ask for those things to be compatible with the new construction, sitting next to the old construction, that's where Harc has the opportunity. I think this is important. You're not allowed to exceed 40 feet in height unless Harc approves it. But that also doesn't mean that Harc is required to approve anything that is 40 feet high. And so if something were proposed and it just was not massing that was compatible, it was not scale that was compatible, was not materials that were compatible, and it did not kind of carefully acknowledge the surrounding existing structures, especially if they're historic, I think that's where Harc has the opportunity to provide the feedback that says, well, we know that you would be allowed up to 40 feet, but in this instance, you're proposing something that would be of a scale that's overwhelming to the surrounding structures and detracts from the surrounding structures, especially if they're historic. And also you're kind of blocking views and in kind of other things that you might be able to point out more specifically in those projects. And so that's one of the reasons that we want to go through this training, not just to make meetings take longer, but also to help make sure that y'all have the vocabulary that to be able to make those comments successfully or to feel confident in making those comments. And if you have a gut feeling that a project is, there's something that's just kind of telling your gut, this is not right, we want to be able to provide you with the tools and the vocabulary to express that in concrete terms instead of, something just doesn't feel right about that. Because something doesn't feel right isn't maybe the most helpful thing to say in a public hearing, and we want to make sure that you can point to some of those more specific things. So in this case, it would be a comment maybe like, well, it does, I see that it meets the building height limitation requirement, but the scale is not compatible with surrounding structures, or the massing of the structure is overwhelming compared to, you know, the street view, or it's overwhelming compared to the surrounding structures. Is that helpful?
Yeah, because that's exactly how we got there in the end, talking about mass and scale. But
And that's,
I just didn't know if it was ever going to be added to our UDC or, but it sounds
probably,
like no.
probably not. I would reckon not. And I only say that because we already have a 40-foot height limit, and I don't know that that's considered something that kind of tips over into needing to decide between air rights or some of those kind of very technical legal aspects.
Right.
If we get there, we will address it, but probably not at 40 feet, I would imagine.
Right. Thanks.
Of course.
To bring up another question related to where Catherine is, I'm sorry if I just interrupted someone. You know, I think similar, that same project, we've had others that we can think of that are on one side, you have residential, and on the other side, you have commercial. So, you know, we're thinking of Eats on 8th is a good example, Wishwell is a good example. And, you know, how should we be talking about, well, so the context around me is the mass and scale behind in the residential may be shorter, but the scale and the context in front of me is similar.
And
so how would you express discussing, you know, a project like that?
That's also a really good question. And so one of the things that we provide for, and I may not have captured it in this presentation, so if not, I apologize. But there is, I think it's in our design guidelines. I might have to get back to y'all on this because I don't want to be looking for this for a long time, but there is a sense of the opportunity to change a building height as you kind of move away or towards other buildings. So if you're building right next to a 4-story building, then 4 stories would not be large in comparison to that building. But if there's a 1-story building on one side and a 4-story building on the other side, where should you go? And so I think that's where you could either, the building could be designed possibly to have a lower height portion near the 1-story and a taller portion near the 4-story. Or the building could, if it was going to be the same height, could kind of reach a middle, and that way it provides a stair step. And so where we do have this condition of the commercial areas kind of are right up next to the residential areas, and that's where this becomes kind of something that we consider a little more carefully. And that's where we have this area in those portions of area 2, because area 1 is right around the courthouse. And then area 2 is the rest of downtown. So we're not going to see right up next to residential in area 1. We're only going to see it area 2. That's why it says that. So in those portions of area 2 that developed as residential blocks, a traditional character, meaning a blend between commercial and residential structures, should be seen. And so the pictures that they're using to illustrate that are not pictures from Georgetown. When we go through the design guideline updates, one of the things that we'll probably be asking for is to provide local examples. So it's nice to see what they did in Boulder, Colorado, but what do we do here in Georgetown, Texas? And so what they're basically showing, though, is that commercial buildings need to kind of make references to that residential character and need to be kind of more, what's the word I'm looking for? They need to better acknowledge the residential character and provide that transition. And so if you wanted to put a 4-story building next to a 1-story house, that would be like really, really abrupt. And so what we would ask for probably instead is a 4-story building is not really a great fit for the context, and the mass of it is overwhelming the structure, the scale of it is overwhelming the structure. And so what we would be asking for is for you to change the building design to better make that transition. And that's something that you're perfectly able to make that comment on and provide that feedback for on an application.
Any other questions from?
Yep, I have one. This is Terry. I guess, so for the Wishwell house, and I don't recall exactly how this all played out, but I thought that a number of commissioners decided that, you know, the massing of the new addition was going to be too overwhelming for the historic structure. And so we denied it, I thought, and then it went to the city council and got approved. Right. So what's the deal there? I mean, can they just ignore all these guidelines all of a sudden after we've gone through all the deliberation and all that stuff and trying to decide what's right for the neighborhood, and then they just get to go to the city and the city council decides anyway? Is that kind of how?
Well, from a process standpoint, so I wasn't here, so it'd be hard for me to speak really specifically, but from a process standpoint, I think that is something that's important for us to highlight. So if someone brings an application to Harc for a decision, and Harc makes a decision, look, this doesn't meet the design guidelines, or it doesn't meet the UDC criteria, or whatever the reason is, we've got 8 different criteria for review for that specific reason. We're asking you to really be compatible with a majority of those. Or there should be like a really good reason why. There should kind of be a reason for, oh, we understand that this kind of doesn't technically meet all the requirements, but this is a project that will provide good outcomes and it's a good fit for our historic district. So when Harc says, we're sorry, but this just doesn't comply with what our standards are, an applicant has the opportunity to appeal that decision to the city council. And the reason that can happen, and I could do a whole nother session just on where we get our authority from, but the reason that happens is that city council is the one that the state of Texas said, you have the authority as basically the representatives, the elected representatives of the city of Georgetown, you have the authority to make legislative decisions. You have the authority to make decisions on applications. And that authority rests with city council unless city council decides to delegate that authority to other boards and commissions. And so city council can act as their own planning and zoning commission, but the city of Georgetown has a lot of planning and zoning business. And so they delegated that to planning and zoning and said, planning and zoning, here are our criteria for how you do reviews and how you do business. And we're going to give that work to you. And please conduct it in this way that we've specified. And for historic projects in our historic districts, city council has the option to do that themselves, but we're very busy in the historic districts. And so city council delegated that authority to Harc and said, Harc, we want you to make those decisions. And these are the criteria that we've set up for you to be able to make those decisions. So the ultimate authority and the reason that applicants can appeal a denial to city council is because that ultimate authority rests with council. Now, the decisions that they choose to make are council's decisions to make with these applications, just like any other application that might be appealed to them. Or in the case of a rezoning, planning and zoning holds a hearing and they make a recommendation to council, but council makes the ultimate decision on rezoning request. And so sometimes there are differences of opinion on what the design guideline means or what the review criteria is. And then sometimes there's not. And so I think it's important that Harc does Harc's job the way that council's kind of specified. Here's the review criteria. Here's what we've set up for you to use as tools. But can council make a different decision on appeal? Yes. And that is council's, that's council's option and their privilege. And a lot of that is because they're elected officials, and that's where the state kind of rests that authority. They've delegated it to the Harc commissioners because that would be an awful lot of applications for the city council to review if they didn't delegate it. So, and I can provide more information on that. I'd be happy to. I just don't know that I want to do all of it tonight unless y'all want to hear it.
Yeah,
and I will.
But that helps. That helps. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Carolee, did you have a question? Okay. I have one other question if nobody else has anything. When related to materials, Britton, if you could move back to the slide where you had the Heritage Plaza compared to the Dimmitt building. So again, we talk a lot about material comparison, and we have applicants who come in and point to, well, there's stone downtown, there's brick downtown, there's wood downtown, and so we're doing the exact same thing. And I think this is a good example of it doesn't always look exactly the same. Now I realize those are from very different eras, but how would we talk about if say someone did bring in materials that we felt like were inferior and weren't going to be up to the standard to some of the other beautiful buildings like the Dimmitt building and the limestone here? How would you suggest that we talk about that, and that all limestone is not the same, all brick is not the same, so that we're saying the right vocabulary that you have brought up tonight, but also being sure that we're building infill in our downtown that is up to the standard of what we already have?
That's a really good question. One of the things that I think is important, and what is y'all give me feedback on how I do my job, that helps me to do my job better, and it also helps me to communicate expectations to applicants. And so one of the things that I want to make sure we're doing well is providing a clear kind of sample of materials. And so it's a little bit difficult in a digital format. Once upon a time, we required applicants to provide physical material samples, and then they would go to the Harc meetings and you would be able to touch and feel stuff. And we don't ask for that anymore. We just ask for basically a picture or a product sheet or something. That makes it a lot harder to touch and feel, and I think there are some disadvantages to that. And so if someone wanted to say, well, we're going to build this brick building and there's already brick downtown, that could be perfectly sufficient. Or what Harc can do, because you have this opportunity, is you have the ability to say, we need to know what that brick is, and we need to know what the color, we need a color palette, or we need a photo of where it's already been installed. We need something that helps us to clearly understand what this brick is. And you have the opportunity to ask for that. And we ask for that in the applications. Sometimes I ask for that really specifically, or say, hey, I need to know the materials, or I need to have these pointed out. We had a case just a couple of weeks ago in which y'all had given the feedback. We need to know very specifically what the materials are that y'all are proposing, and we need a way to understand that. And so one of the ways that we can do that is to do, photos of materials installed. I think that's a pretty helpful way to see what it looks like. You can get really specific, and some historic districts have rules that are this specific about mortar color. So what is what you probably often call grout between the bricks or between the stones? Like, what is that color going to be? What is the color of the stone? What does this look like? What is kind of the texture? Downtown has a lot of textures in the historic buildings, and you might have 4 and 5 different materials in the facade of a historic building. And a lot of those have a lot of texture that's developed over time. So sometimes when we're looking at new buildings and old buildings, or old materials and new materials, sometimes the old materials have just had 100 years or more to age, and that's why they look that way. And they did not look exactly that way when they were installed. But sometimes, and I think I can point this out with these two buildings, they're both using limestone, but one of the limestone blocks is cut in a very particular shape, and it has a very particular rough texture on the face. Now that rough texture is part of why the building has so much darkness to it, because there are a lot of little colonies of microorganisms that are causing that dark coloration because they're living in the water that stone sucks up. Whereas the building on the right, which is the newer building, it's a much smoother surface. So they're both stone, they're both limestone, they're both materials that are local, they're both materials that are traditional. The difference that you're seeing is the design of the building facade. So we're seeing some arches in the building on the left that we don't see on the right, but you're also seeing differences in the dimensions of the stones themselves that were used, and you're seeing a difference in the way the face of the stone is textured. And so sometimes looking at old materials and saying, what is it that makes up this material is a helpful way to compare it to new materials and saying, what is it that makes up this new material? And so in the photo on the far top left, right under the word commercial, there is actually a few different kinds of brick on this building. And I think one of the things that we like about old brick buildings is that there's so much color and texture variation in it, and it's kind of interesting and cool. Whereas the building right next to it has been painted, so we know that it's brick. It's also got some stucco over the brick, and we don't see as much of the texture, and there's not the color variation, but we still kind of know that it's old brick. Where on the right, you're looking at much smoother stone. And even though some of the stone in those pictures on the right is textured and it has that rough surface, and it's a little bit similar to the old buildings, there's some very smooth stone in it too that's not quite as similar. And so one of the things that we want to make sure that y'all have is enough information to make a decision. And some of that might include being specific and saying, I'm going to need to see more clear examples of the materials, or I'm looking at this material and I understand that it's brick, but this is not brick that we have in our downtown, and this is not brick that has any similarity. So let's say somebody, I'm going to kind of pick on yellow brick because there's this really funny, I think it's really funny. When the city of Georgetown built kind of the fire station expansion next to the old city hall, it's the building that Thundercloud Subs is in now. They used a brick that's kind of a yellowy tan tint, and Clara Scarborough was really offended by it. And I know this because when she wrote the National Register nomination for the Courthouse Historic District, the Courthouse National Register Historic District, she very specifically pointed that building out, and she was kind of disgusted by it and called it an unsympathetic yellow brick, meaning that Clara Scarborough was very particularly concerned that the brick that they had used was not compatible with any of the other brick in the historic district. And what's funny is that we might walk by Thundercloud Sub today and not even notice it because it kind of blends in with everything else. But at the time, she really felt that it stood out. And I kind of like to pick on Miss Scarborough for that comment, but I think it does really well illustrate something that she could very clearly define and say, I understand that it's brick, but it's not brick that's compatible or consistent with the brick that we have on our historic buildings. And that could have been the color, it could have been the texture. I have a feeling it was just the color because we didn't have that color brick anywhere else. And so that's something that you can also kind of look at. We have a lot of red brick, and we tend to have the kind of a medium red light brick. We don't have really, really light red, and we don't have really, really dark red very often. And it's not to say that we couldn't, it's just that most of our brick is kind of the medium shade of red that you can see there on the left. So hopefully that's helpful, but I'm always happy to provide more information if you need more.
Thank you, Britton. Yeah, I love the idea of asking for pictures of installed materials.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be something that we start to talk about as we move forward with some things.
Okay.
And, you know, hopefully as we look at more conceptuals, you know, that's even helpful too, to say, can we see that installed? So what other questions do we have for Britton? Okay, well, thank you, Britton. That was great information. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And like building it into meetings where we have, you know, just one project. That's great. So, okay, we're going to move on to our well, not our last item, but item G, which is staff updates. And I don't know if that is that Nat tonight?
Good evening, Commissioners. Excellent discussion, great training, Britton. Appreciate your responses and your thorough, your demonstration of understanding the principles and talking through the principles. It was helpful to hear you apply them. And so I look forward to more training with Britton's got scheduled for you coming up. But Sophia is on the line, but she and I were chatting about updates for you, Commissioners. Really kind of the significant one is just that, and I'd like Britton to share her thoughts, what she knows about the agency, but we have selected and negotiated a contract with Post Oak, who is out of San Antonio. I'm going to chat their website address in the chat bar, but we have negotiated a contract with Post Oak Preservation for the update to the design guidelines. We are excited about getting this work started, and this training has been purposeful and getting your feedback on some of the things that you'd like to see improved. And we will be keeping these things in mind and keeping you updated and informed and engaged in many cases on some of the recommended solutions. As you may recall, in 2019, the council directed some updates to our design guidelines, and that is driving the scope of our work with you and Post Oak Preservation. And our next step with them is to have them come up from San Antonio, sit down with us to go over the project schedule. We will then kind of finalize that project schedule and start talking about the scope of the overhaul based on that 2019 direction from the council. And then be coming forward to you and the public in a meaningful way. I don't know if Britton wants to share anything about what she knows about what excites her about working with Post Oak, but I'll turn it over to her.
So I am really excited to work with this group. They come with a lot of experience, and they come with a lot of experience working with historic buildings very directly. And so part of their staff has a lot of project experience and a pretty long project resume of working on historic tax credit projects. And so they are really accustomed to going through the application with process with buildings. And so it was really helpful to us that this is a firm that has application experience and also experience with how to really well treat and steward historic buildings, how to take care of materials, how to repair materials, how to replace materials. They just have a lot of very hands-on experience being in buildings and being in historic buildings of all kinds. Government buildings, school buildings, commercial buildings, not as many residential from a tax credit perspective, but their knowledge of materials and their knowledge of kind of best practices is really, really strong. They also have staff in their firm who have been a version of me in other cities. And so have a lot of experience with reviewing applications and gave us some really kind of strong indication that they would be just really knowledgeable about how to have design guidelines that complement an application review process, which we were really excited about. And I think also we're looking at kind of some particular things for updates, and they had just a lot of very direct experience around that. And so we're really looking forward to that. One of the other things that was really attractive to us and helped us to feel really confident that they would do a good job was that they are going to be very available to us locally. And so even though we're in a time that we're having a lot of virtual meetings, and even though a lot of their staff is based out of San Antonio, they also have staff out of Austin, and they can be right here with us, and they can be right here in our historic districts. And one of the very first things that they asked to do was, we want to be in Georgetown, we want to take photos, we want to see our historic districts, and their ability to be here with us and see things on the ground was really important to us and something that they were committed to, which was very exciting to have somebody who was going to be here. And I think that that's very important because Georgetown is completely unique, and what our historic districts look like is sometimes really hard to capture if you're just looking at a video screen. So I was excited that they were committed to putting their staff on the ground here in our historic districts. So if you see people running around taking photos, that's probably what it's for, or it's me. I do that too.
Thanks, Britton. Nat and Britton, what's the timeline for this project from start to completion?
Well, we really want to hear from what they have to say, but we anticipate 9 to 12 months, kind of going from existing conditions, kind of what are the changes that the council directed back in April? What do we have staff have heard and know to be things that we need their recommendations on? Then there's going to be some public engagement to kind of make sure that we're capturing the universe of things that need updated. And then there's some time where they go away and think about those things and engage with those recommendations, and then bring them back and take that again back through the public process, and including engaging with you as the commission and the public, and then finalizing those recommendations, and then ultimately printing a new copy and creating an online version that is more accessible. So we initially scoped it to be 9 to 12 months, and we have some affirmation from them when we did our interviews that they thought it was also something we could accomplish. So really looking forward to that. Last exchange I had with them was trying to get together this month to go over that schedule. So hopefully next time we meet, I should be able to provide you some more details on a draft schedule.
Okay, thank you. Anything else that we need to say or do?
No, there's updates from staff.
Okay. Thank you, Nat. Thank you, Britton. That was great information. Britton, the only other thing I wanted to mention to you is that if you have not shared the information on the Cody family, that information with Megan Firestone at Southwestern, she might have interest in hearing this. We work we still work very closely with the Cody family at Southwestern. Their descendants are still very involved.
Well, and I just kind of at the last minute was for other purposes looking through Southwestern yearbooks and saw Professor Cody and went, oh my gosh, that's who that is, and kind of made that connection. So y'all know me, there are always more stories to come. So I'm sure you'll be hearing about it at some point.
Yeah, well, I know you're connected with Megan, so just wanted to mention that. She might appreciate that context to the neighborhood. All right, so thank you all very much. Hopefully we will continue to have fall weather next time we see each other for the rest of we will not move back to summer at this point, and head closer to 2021 when hopefully we can see each other again. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn. It's Catherine Morales.
Thank you, Catherine. Carolee, I see a second. Okay, we will vote. Commissioner Parr, approve. Commissioner Johnston.
I'll take the yellow brick road through the screen to Post Oak and end the meeting.
Thank you. Commissioner Browner.
Yes.
Commissioner Morales.
Yes.
Commissioner Hyde.
Yes.
Commissioner McCabe.
Yes.
And Commissioner Nunn.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. Y'all have a great evening. Appreciate you all.
I hope everybody remains safe.